On October 3, 2025, Bloomberg reported that China is urging the U.S. government to cancel national security restrictions on Chinese companies investing in the U.S., such as CFIUS reviews and export controls, and to use a massive investment package as an exchange condition. One source mentioned that China floated a $1 trillion investment scale earlier this year, but the current discussions lack clarity on the specific amount and structure. This could include direct investments in U.S. infrastructure, technology, or energy sectors to reshape the investment barriers between the U.S. and China over the past decade. Many people think this is baseless rumor-mongering, since a $1 trillion investment in the U.S. would greatly stimulate U.S. prosperity and create a draining effect on China. This would also mean that China is essentially bowing to the U.S. in exchange for peace. But to be honest, I do not think it is completely without basis, since it comes from a mainstream media outlet like Bloomberg. An anonymous source not involved in the U.S.-China showdown could not secure such prominent coverage. However, I also do not believe China is desperate to seek peace with the U.S. China's economic pressures are significant, but its society remains very stable. The number of domestic trips during the National Day holiday hit a new record high, showing strong consumer spending power among the public. China's export data is also solid, and while GDP growth has slowed somewhat, it remains relatively healthy among major economies. The real question is whether a $1 trillion investment in the U.S. in exchange for a truce is feasible, and why such back-channel messages from the negotiating table are leaking out. First, we must clarify that the trade war and tech war between China and the U.S. have lasted 7 years, initiated during Trump's first term. By now, Americans should have a full realization that the U.S. cannot crush China head-on. In the words of Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary leading U.S. negotiations, China's strength and resilience far exceed those of the Soviet Union, Japan, and the EU, making it a completely different opponent. The U.S. two parties are tough on China, and mainstream public opinion in the U.S. is firmly anti-China as well. However, the crises within the U.S. are far more severe than those in China. The two parties are deeply divided, society is fractured, and U.S. debt has already surpassed $37 trillion and continues to rise rapidly. Trump's trade war has led to uncontrollable inflation, while the tech war has restricted U.S. companies from accessing cheap Chinese components, dramatically increasing survival pressures. Under these circumstances, China could not possibly proactively propose investing in the U.S. to ease the trade war. This seems more like a negotiating tactic from the Chinese side, a rhetorical counter to unreasonable U.S. demands. In other words, the U.S. claims that Chinese people have stolen American jobs, that U.S.-China trade has caused U.S. deindustrialization, and that Chinese companies developing in the U.S. threaten U.S. national interests. So China invests in the U.S. to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with China, and on a massive scale, from education to infrastructure to factories. China can contribute vast funds to U.S. economic prosperity, while the U.S. must cancel its trade sanctions and tech blockades on China. As for U.S. concerns about national security, Chinese companies can follow the TikTok model. Chinese companies retain control over intellectual property and branding, but operations involve deep U.S. participation or even U.S. dominance, with China taking dividends. This proposal is a win-win. If the Trump administration agrees, China and the U.S. can immediately halt the trade war and tech war for mutual benefit. China would even not mind letting the U.S. gain more. Being the world's second-largest economy suits China just fine for now, with no concern for the vanity of being the #1 superpower. But China's proposal is calculated on the fact that the U.S. will not agree. The U.S.'s core task right now is still to crush China through the trade war and tech war. If the U.S. misses this opportunity, it may never defeat China again. Trump is negotiating with China to trick it into accepting his proposals, completely sacrificing China's national interests to serve the U.S. He treats China like a muscle-bound fool, unbeatable in a fight, but susceptible to deception. Just as Reagan led the Western world in tricking the Soviet Union into collapse. Yet Trump is no Reagan. He is merely a clumsy imitator of Reagan, and China is no Soviet Union. Chinese people are not as easy to fool as Russians. China maintains contact and negotiations with the U.S., making small concessions where possible without harming its interests, to satisfy Trump's ego. But on core interests, China will not yield an inch. Trump seeks to deceive China into errors through talks, while China uses negotiations to buy time and prepare further. The current situation is that both China and the U.S. face enormous pressures. But China is the challenger and does not need to maintain a powerful military presence worldwide like the U.S., which drains its national strength to uphold its role as world policeman. China's productivity and production efficiency far exceed those of the U.S., so the later the U.S.-China showdown, the more advantageous it is for China. Thus, China's strategy is to always be ready for a full showdown with the U.S., harboring no illusions about it, and solidly preparing for complete U.S.-China decoupling, while accepting this reality. At the same time, China is willing to tangle with the U.S. in negotiations. Since Trump thinks he is clever, China can treat him like a monkey in a zoo, toss him a peanut every now and then to let him indulge in the illusion of constant victories. If he and his MAGA fans want to believe they are winning nonstop, with America becoming greater wave after wave, Chinese people are willing to applaud them and toss even more peanuts. If Trump agrees to the Chinese proposal, China would not fear signing an investment deal. A $1 trillion investment is no big deal. Trump has already extracted trillions of dollars in total investment commitments from Middle Eastern countries, Japan, South Korea, and European allies. These are all loose, long-term investment intentions without legal binding. China could symbolically launch some projects during Trump's remaining term, drag out the time, and renegotiate with the new president a few years later when they take the White House. If the U.S. refuses to talk, China will simply show down with the U.S. So I do not think the news of China's $1 trillion investment in the U.S. in exchange for a truce is fabricated, but it also does not qualify as major news. It is just a negotiating ploy,